You're now listening to Sanity at the Movies, great poetry edition, because we are going to start out with one of the most famous poems of its time by the youngest person ever to receive the Nobel Prize for Literature. And you are going to have your mind blown. I did not include all the stanzas because there's a lot of them, but I think Ben's got the first stanza and Jake's got the last stanza. So take it away, Ben.
All right. I'm just going to read this with an American accent because
that's what I'm going to do.
Yeah. You may talk a gin and beer when you're quartered safe out here, and you're sent to penny fights and aldershot it. But when it comes to slaughter, you will do your work on water, and you'll lick the bloomin' boots of him that's got it. Now in India's sunny clime, where I used to spend my time, a servant of Her Majesty the Queen, of all them black-faced crew, the finest man I knew was our regimental beastie, Gunga Din. He was Dean, 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 you limpin' lump of brick dust, Gunga Din. Hi, slippy hitherow, wather get it, panny low, you squidgy-nosed old idol, Gunga Din.
Good stuff. So then there's several more stanzas, and we conclude with this.
He carried me away to where a dooley lay, and a bullet come and drilled the beggar clean. He put me safe inside, and just before he died, I hope you liked your drink, says Gunga Din.
Says Gunga Din, please.
Nice, he says. So I'll meet him later on at the place where he is gone, where it's always double drill and no canteen. You'll be squatting on the coals, giving drink to poor damn souls, and I'll get a swig in hell from Gunga Din.
Ooh.
Yes, Dean, 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 you Lazarushian leather Gunga Din, though I've belted you and flayed you by the living God that made you. You're a better man than I am, Gunga Din.
It's important to emphasize that this is all written in crummy dialect.
It's Cockney.
So, for example, by the livin', Livin, God is Gawd, that made you. Anyway, we're not here to beat up on Rudyard Kipling, or maybe we are. I don't know. Rudyard Kipling was quite the man. But for our purpose, and we'll talk about him and his legacy and all that stuff. But for our purposes, he wrote the poem Gunga Din, which inspired the movie Gunga Din, which came out in 1939, which is, of course, Hollywood's greatest year. I didn't make that up. That's what people say. No less than The Wizard of Oz, Gone with the Wind, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, The Women, Stagecoach, Dark Victory, and many other films came out that year. The Hollywood studio system was at its height, and the Dream Factory was just pumping out one classic after another, and Gunga Din is one of them, although it hasn't really lasted as long in the cultural memory as some of the other ones, quite possibly because it's in black and white, and it's got a lot of brown face, I guess you'd say, and some other things. I don't know. We'll talk about whether it should have lasted, but it's Gunga Din. If it has a claim to fame these days, it's because some guys named Spielberg and Lucas ripped off a lot of its mythology for a little film called Indiana-Jones and the Temple of Doom, pretty directly cribbing from the stuff here. This movie's kind of famous as a proto-Indiana-Jones, proto-Butch and Sundance, proto-Joss Whedon, we're going to have quippy guys go on adventures and not take them very seriously. This is like the original that.
Until they do.
Until the movie wants us to take it seriously. But, well, you actually said, well, we shouldn't get to your take right away, but you said this was a proto-something else.
Which I might not remember what I said.
You said it was a proto. You said it felt like a proto Michael Bay movie or something like that.
Yeah, I did.
Just in the sort of, this is all glib and ridiculous in Hollywood.
It feels like a proto 80s superhero movie.
Yes,
to me, where you have guys that for no explicable reason except that there are heroes can just laughingly put down 20 guys at a time until such time as they can't. And there's nothing special about them. They don't look special. If there's anything special about them, it's that they're white. And that's really it. They're just the guys that show up and laugh and drink and tell jokes and beat the crap out of everybody.
Right. Yeah, it's very 80s in that it's got that kind of 80s style machismo, that sort of, well, there are heroes. So I guess it's kind of like a Bill Murray movie almost. Like, he's a terrible person, but we like him because he's Bill Murray, so he can do whatever he wants. This has a very Bill Murray kind of a scene. I mean, it's not anything like as funny as what Bill Murray would do with it. Actually, it's one of the lamest scenes of the entire movie, in my humble opinion, but they basically spike this guy's drink. And we're not set up to really dislike this character, except he must be dislikable because
our guys don't like him.
Our guys don't like him, and he's standing in the way of their camaraderie or whatever. And so,
yeah, and they take the opportunity of the scene to make him dislikable.
Right. But I was surprised by how little work the movie did to actually give us one 30-second scene where he kicks a beggar or something, so that then we can feel good about these guys spiking his drink and humiliating him and sending him to the hospital and all this stuff. Like a Bill Murray movie would actually probably give us a little bit more. Let's set this guy up as a real jerk so we can knock him down. But
yeah. Well, the Michael Bay of it all to me is the lack of connective tissue. Just going to shift gears into being completely silly, then shift gears into being like, this is epic action, and then shift gears into this is sentimental hogwash, or this is important drama, is what the movie might think, but sentimental hogwash. It will just do that as many times as it wants.
Right.
And I know Hollywood's been doing that a long time. I think just in a Michael Bay film, you feel it more. In this movie, I felt it more.
Well, yeah, I should say this movie does have a direct lineage, because the movie that really in the 70s created the whole glib mindset of wisecracking heroes who don't take anything seriously was Butch and Sundance, which was written by William Goldman. William Goldman saw Gunga Din at a young age and said it made the most giant impression on him. So there's a direct lineage from this to that to Spielberg and Lucas and 80s and Star Wars and all that kind of stuff. Forgive me, Butch and Sundance I think is 69 actually, but then less than 10 years later you have A New Hope, which is famous for its sort of glib approach to, although Lucas and Spielberg I think really mastered the art of making those things feel pretty homogenized for the most part.
I think so. Even Butch and the Sundance Kid, like it or not, it has a pretty consistent texture.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Across the whole film.
I think that's true. It does have, if you remember, the ending is super brutal and kind of nihilistic, and it kind of comes out of nowhere after raindrops falling on my head.
But it also has some of the best one-liners as they're getting shot to death. Yeah.
Next time, I was going to try and say it, but I can't remember it. Well, Gunga Din. It's a film that we watched. We have Dial of Destiny coming out this year, Indiana Jones. I'm hoping very soon that maybe even by the time this episode is released, that our Patreon will be up to $250 a month, which would be very easy for it to get up. So we'll be talking about Batman. I hope this year we get to talk about the Burton Batmans and the Reeves Supermans and stuff.
Yeah, that'll be a lot of fun.
Yeah. And
it'll provide a lot of fun context for just everything that's going on and that people are enjoying or not enjoying today.
Right.
Man,
and so
3-hour-long discussion of Superman 4.
Yep.
Oh, wow.
We have already established we're not doing Forever or And Robin or Richard Pryor Superman or Sun Guy Superman. The reason being...
They're terrible.
They're terrible.
They're so terrible.
And there's not really anything to say. I mean, we're not a bad movie podcast. We like to have fun. We're like to joke around.
Podcast.
But we don't just watch something so we can dunk on it that we know is going to be terrible. Usually, I'm sure you could name something we've done like that. I want to have a point. I'd love to dunk on Shrek for 3 hours, but there would be a point.
There would be a
point to doing that. Yeah, Shrek basically ruined culture and movies. So, oh my goodness. So yeah, I got excited about talking about Gunga Din. A, because I remembered it was a really fun adventure movie. B, because we were all in the mood for something old with Cary Grant. And C, because I thought it would tie in.
Yeah, I remember. I'm just trying to remember the conversation. We had been hitting up against walls, and I think I was the one who was like, I just wish there was a Cary Grant film that I hadn't seen. And then you got really excited because you pulled this one and connected it to everything. And I remember you talking about it before, but I had forgotten that it existed.
I had also forgotten that it existed. So when the light bulb went off in my head, I literally gasped. And you guys were like, "What? Did you step on a nail or something?" And say, no.
I just had a brilliant idea.
Which I've never done in my entire life before or since. And did this movie live up to that gasp? Well, that's a question. That's a question we'll answer. I remembered this movie a little more fondly than I think it probably deserved. But I do think it's a fun and interesting movie to talk about. And certainly it does tie into a lot of stuff. And I don't know. We'll see where we land with our take. Ben, did you bring any baggage or context or anything to this?
I remember seeing this movie on my grandfather's shelf, and He had a lot of war movies and stuff. I had no interest in war movies as a kid. It all looked very boring to me. So I just associated this with, there's a boring old movie. That's
there you go. Boring old movie on Grandpa's shelf.
That's right.
And you don't mean that it was playing on Grandpa's shelf. You mean that there was
It just sat there.
a cassette tape
It sat there. I never saw any of it. I'd never seen a single scene before.
Are you a Kipling head?
No.
Are you a Kipling hater?
I wouldn't say I'd even go that far. I'm just Kipling indifferent. So I read Jungle Book when I was a kid. I guess I disliked it, more or less.
You did like it, or you disliked it?
Disliked it. I read both volumes of it in the cheap paperback editions I had. And that's all I remember, that it was sometimes a little bit enjoyable. But also, generally, I didn't enjoy those stories. I did like, what's his name, Ricky Tikki Tavi?
Ricky Tikki Tavi and the Just So stories, I think, are better than Jungle Book.
Which I haven't read the Just So stories.
I think they're more fun, actually. I think they're underrated and Jungle Book is overrated.
Yeah.
Except for Ricky Tikki Tavi, which is probably the best thing he ever did.
Yeah.
I don't know if the Jungle Book actually is overrated because I don't know that I've talked to anyone that actually likes it. I'm sure they exist, but like people love the Disney movie from like the animated
I
thing.
always hated that too.
But
It
does
gets
anyone...
a lot of credit, I think, from Disney.
Yeah.
It just sort of rubs off on it. People have a positive disposition toward it, whether they know better or not.
Oh, it's
unless
weird.
they've gotten into it, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. It's weird. I just had a argument with somebody about C.S. Lewis where I dared on Twitter to criticize something about C.S. Lewis, and that always brings
His
out...
take on pederasty, no less.
Yeah, I said, C.S. Lewis trying to defend pederasty as having some kind of virtue in it was not a good thing.
Probably the worst thing about him.
And that brings out the NPCs and the jackals swarm, and it's just like you cannot say anything bad about C.S. Lewis. And when you think about it, it's not because he was such a great theologian or thinker or intellectual. Let me be a little condescending to my critics here. The reason that you cannot say anything bad about C.S. Lewis is because he wrote Narnia, and that's the beginning and
that
end.
hideous strength.
And that hideous strength. But that hideous strength is what conservatives like. The reason I think people have such affection, like the reason he's just unassailable, you cannot say one bad word about him, is because
Narnia's beloved.
yeah, it imprints on you when you're 7, and those are the things that you just hold dear in a way that make you weird. It's like I'm not. If I attack C.S. Lewis, even his take on pederasty, what someone hears is not this guy had a weird take on pederasty. What they hear is my childhood, and so I think people just are really and so the only reason I bring up any of that is because I think Kipling, as you say, gets a lot of credit because people like a Disney movie.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, I don't even know if Kipling would be a name in the conversation anymore if it wasn't for that Disney. For one thing, he's wildly out of fashion in terms of his politics.
Everybody hates him.
Yeah, everybody who has any kind of critical capacity, or the Academy, the Chattering Class, they do not like Kipling. And I don't know if they're wrong. I know there's a certain kind of conservative, certainly there's a certain kind of racist conservative that wants to come back and own Kipling. And I like the poem If. Everybody likes that Be a Man, My Son poem. Mm-hmm. It's good. You know, he's got some good kind of love your country, love your family kind of stuff that we wouldn't feel bad owning. And we could have an interesting discussion about the white man's burden, which is another poem. He coined that phrase and wrote a poem called The White Man's Burden. And I think probably all three of us would be sympathetic to the idea that a superior culture actually does need to go in and help and develop a inferior culture and save the inferior culture from savagery. Like we don't hate that idea the way that post-colonial theory academics hate that idea. We're not on Pocahontas' side when we watch Pocahontas. But that being said, Kipling, we just read that poem. None of us would want to own the worldview of that Gunga Din poem. It's just condescending. I don't know. Jake, do you have any other Kipling baggage to talk about before
Kipling?
Yeah.
Are we just doing Kipling baggage and then doing
or any other movie baggage, I guess, yeah.
I liked the Just So stories when I read them to my kids a long time ago.
And that, for people who don't know, is how did the elephant get his trunk? It's those kinds of stories.
Stuff like that.
And that's how the alligator got his snout.
Yeah, it's just fun little stuff like that. I did not like the Jungle Book when I read it to my kids coming out of Just So stories.
Right.
Except for Ricky Tikki Tavi. This movie I've never seen and hadn't really heard of except from you. So my baggage is like Indiana Jones and Cary-Grant
Right.
So that's really it. There's really nothing else to bring to it.
Two great tastes. Did they go great together? We'll find out, folks. My baggage is, I remember reading Rikki Tikki Tavi and loving it. Rikki Tikki Tavi, if you don't know, is the story of a mongoose that battles cobras, and it's just an amazing little short adventure story for boys, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And it's great. It's great. And I don't think I even remembered that it was Kipling. I just knew it from being a little kid. And then when we did the Jungle Book for the Bookening, now well over half a decade ago, it was like, this kind of isn't that great. It's kind of weird. Kipling's worldview is weird. His conception of who the animals are, like, this isn't lovable Baloo. It is so hard not to process
Filter
things
it
back through the movie.
Yeah.
And it's hard not to want the movie. Like, where's the bare necessities? And instead, it's these weird poems, self-indulgent poems, and all this kind of law of the jungle. You could tell Darwin was a big deal kind of stuff.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's just weird. I don't even know how to describe it. I guess you can go listen to that's like the third Bookening episode that we ever did. So I don't know how proud we'd actually be of it now, but you can certainly go listen to that to hear our take. But I remember finding this movie when I was a teenager and really liking it. And liking it as a proto-Indiana-Jones thing. I think I remembered it as being even more that. I remembered it as having more action and more kind of jungle flavor than it actually does. It basically has one good action scene and no jungle flavor. It's pretty obviously filmed in California. But so we'll talk about whether it actually holds up. But I remembered it holding up. I remembered it being good. I was excited to talk about it. But we've got some context we need to talk about. First, Ben, you did a little research on the Tuggies. This movie is heavy on the Tuggy
Yes.
Murder cult.
or whatever it is.
Yeah. I pronounce them thugs because that's the pronunciation I found. But Tuggies or thugs.
Yeah, so I think
thugs.
I think you're actually right, although I've certainly heard.
You've heard
Tugs.
Tuggies, yeah. Yeah. Well, so there were supposedly in India at this time roaming bands of murderers and robbers called thugs or thuggies. And supposedly these guys had a formal inherited culture of robbery and murder, like with its own traditions and rules passed down from father to son. Like you're going to strangle a victim more often than not. And maybe you're going to use a catgut garrote, or you're going to use a special scarf, a murder scarf, as I believe this movie calls it. Maybe you'd stab or poison, but strangling is better. And so the thugs, they're going to pose as friendly, innocent travelers, and they're going to come up beside you as you're traveling and say, hey, can we travel with you?
Actually, not unlike the beginning of this.
That's right. This movie follows exactly kind of the lore of what the thugs were. And so they gain your trust, and over a period of maybe just a day, maybe a whole week, they gain your trust. And then at a certain moment, the men of the thuggy cult stand behind their victims as they sit unsuspecting around the campfire, and the leader gives a signal. Maybe it's like, pass the salt. And suddenly everyone has their scarf out, and while one thuggy holds down the arms of the innocent traveler, the other one strangles him. And so very quietly, everyone is murdered, and then maybe the bodies are mutilated so that they can't be identified. Maybe they're thrown in a river, they're buried, whatever, and the thuggies loot them. Supposedly, they also did this for a religious purpose, and this is a big deal in the movie. It's an act of worship to the Hindu goddess Kali, who's the goddess of, it turns out, war, anger, time, change, creation, destruction, and power. She's also a manifestation of the goddess Shakti, who's like the goddess to end all goddesses in Hinduism. She's the mother of all living beings. She's personal, I guess, but also like primordial cosmic energy. So there's a lot of Hindu religious stuff feeding into this. But is that all true? Well, that's been really heavily disputed. How much, if any of that is true?
So it could just be the British colonialists othering these people and telling scary stories about these people that they'd conquered.
People have certainly argued that the British, they hyperbolized. They made stuff up out of just what robbers were doing. Random robbers in India. And I read about this book that I'd love to read sometime. I think it's just called Thuggy. And apparently, this guy's conclusion, I don't remember the author's name, is that religious stuff? No, not really. There wasn't, except insofar as a lot of these guys were Hindus. And although some of them were Muslims, and some of them were like, at least there was Islam around, and it was often syncretistic. So you'd often have Muslims who were also worshiping certain Hindu deities, and that might have been a thing feeding in. But there was a real thuggy thing, a real thuggy phenomenon. Locate my notes here. Yeah, in the 1830s, there is a British officer. And so this is when the East India Trading Company is like taking power and ruling with its own military. This is before the British government takes over India, which is 1857. But there's a British officer named Major General Sir William Henry Sleeman, who's nicknamed William Thuggy Sleeman. And he was like, these guys are a big deal. They're a big threat. And so he systematically interrogates and executes hundreds of thugs, or so-called thugs. And he was doing all of this kind of stuff that anticipates modern police work. He has this organized way of interrogating and following leads and finding where these gangs are. And he was a really smart guy. Interesting. Administrator, linguist. And
it's important to say he actually, I read somewhere, he let people off the hook. Like, he did not just find everyone guilty. So as soon as you hear that, your colonial theory program brain wants to say, they just rounded up a bunch of India people and
scapegoated
them and
made an example of them and told a story that made them feel better about themselves for it.
Right.
And that was part of
And maybe there's something to that, but it was definitely more complicated than that.
It was more complicated. And this stuff is archived. There's all these records of the interrogations and confessions that he did. And so it seems incontrovertible that these guys were real, these thugs. But they were a mixture of things. They weren't like one thing. They were like, oh, we're forming a gang. Let's go kill some people because we're whatever. Okay, there you have that. Then you have standing gangs like we have. You might even have some hereditary murder training, maybe, passed down. That's a little harder to tell. But no evidence of a specific religious connection. There was some kind of preference for strangulation. And apparently, this is an interesting detail. Strangulation afforded these murderers, at least at times, some protection under Indian law. Because for Indian law, you would be sentenced to death if you shed the blood of your victim. And technically, strangling doesn't shed any blood. And so you might be able to get off. And so, anyway, you might not be risking execution, just hard labor and a penalty. So, and if you look up the Wikipedia entry on thugs, you'll notice all these different accounts and ideas, even there, of what they are or were, what they did or didn't do. They didn't kill the children of their victims. Well, they did kill women and children to loot them. The thugs always hid their murderous intent. No, the thugs had a special dagger that was like their status symbol, and they wore it proudly across their chest. So you'll find all of that stuff on the same Wikipedia entry.
Right.
And so maybe all of that's true at different times, or I didn't read the Thuggy book, but man, is this a big rabbit hole. So they were real, whatever they were.
Maybe just highway robbers.
Highway robbers plus standing gangs plus, it sounds like it was a big problem. It sounds like it was really dangerous to be a traveler. Yeah, so you should read the book Thug. That's right. That's what it's called. Thug by Mike Dash.
There you go.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like ninjas, or I'm trying to think of other parallels, like the things that really existed, but then so much fun to add a dash of folklore to it and say, well, obviously they were all part of a murder conspiracy and they still exist, and Indiana Jones is going to find them and they're going to be ripping people's hearts out with their demonic power. And they're just kind of the perfect, that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's right. But not just a British colonial invention.
Right. But maybe a British colonial exaggeration or...
Yeah, seems to be. Yeah. And remember, thugs it's just basically hugs with an extra letter.
Mm-hmm. That was their slogan.
Hugs for thugs.
Hugs for thugs.
Hugs for thugs. Well, not a lot of people want to hug Rudyard Kipling these days, and I'll tell you why in the next part of our context. It's important to say he was one of the most popular short story writers and poets of his time. He has fallen completely out of favor. As we were saying earlier, it's just interesting because he's still in the public consciousness. He probably will be forever, and it might really just be Disney. It's kind of like, is Dracula a novel that has staying power, or is Bela Lugosi an image that has staying power? I don't really know. It's a pretty effective novel, but it's also like the image of Dracula is way more effective than the novel of Dracula. And if we had Sherlock Holmes, I think we can say, even if there had never been movies of Sherlock Holmes, he was so popular and the idea of Sherlock Holmes is so great. I think Sherlock Holmes would just be around in the culture no matter what. But I don't know about Rudyard Kipling. There's probably people listening. He is beloved by a certain strain of conservatives, not all of them horrible, racist, but just people who kind of like manly war stories. And that poem, If, you'll see that on Twitter every now and again, or social media. Somebody will post his poem, If, which is, if you've done this, if you've done that, if you've done this, when you can look a man in the eye, when you can do your duty, when you can, then you'll be a man, my
I forgot.
son.
My dad actually gave me a framed copy of If when I graduated high school. Yep.
It's like you get
Yeah,
you
it's
get a copy of If, and you get the places you'll go.
That's
you
usually
know.
elementary school.
No, you get
graduation.
other places you'll go too.
Right.
Okay.
those,
Yeah.
those two things.
Some ironic aunt
Right.
thinks it's cute.
But he was enormously popular. I mean, he's enormously popular enough that there's a whole generation of our dads, and then certainly a generation of our grandpas, and certainly a generation of our great-grandpas who loved the guy, knew the guy. And people in the early 20th century would have been able to quote Gunga Din. They would have known what you were talking about if you said... And it's still, we still use the phrase... What's the phrase about Gunga Din? You're a better man than I am, Gunga Din. You may not even know what it means, but you've probably heard somebody
I don't know that I have.
say that. I've heard people say that. It's just, you know, like Ben is going to go to the party with all the lame people, and Nathan's not going to the lame party because he hates going to lame parties. And Nathan mutters under his breath, "You're a better man than I am, Gunga Din." It's like that kind of
Okay.
dynamic. But certainly our great-grandfathers would have used that phrase more than we would. So Rudyard Kipling. The New Yorker said, quote, "Kipling has been variously labeled a colonialist, a jingoist, a racist, an anti-Semite, a misogynist, a right-wing imperialist warmonger. And though some scholars have argued that his views were more complicated than he is given credit for, to some degree, he really was all those things," unquote. And I think the New Yorker is not wrong in this particular case. He was born in India to a father who was a Methodist minister who was an interesting guy. He went to India and started an art school. And the art school is one of those things that you can find people really praising because it was meant to... What's the word? It was meant to praise and promote Indian culture, Indian art, stuff like that. But people will also accuse it of being horribly sort of white supremacist appropriation type stuff because it wasn't really meant to appropriate or to promote Indian culture for the use of the Indians. It was more just, hey, these people have all this great art and why should we destroy it all? Let's make sure that we assimilate what's good about this culture. So again, we could spend the entire podcast talking about the good or the bad or that, and we'd probably need a lot more information before we made our judgment. But his father was the principal of Gigi Bahoy School of Art in India. Young Rudyard was born in 1865, and he spoke English, but also spoke whatever the name of the Indian language was, knew both languages, and just thought of India as this paradise with elephants and stuff. It just really connected to India, and then got sent when he was a young man to a boarding school, which he and his sister both referred to as the House of Desolation. So this relates to C.S. Lewis. Not that we're talking about C.S. Lewis. We were just talking about him off mic. But Rudyard Kipling's another one of these guys that went through the horrible British boarding school experience. And so he's kind of this guy. He's thought of as quite a British nationalist, but he grew up loving India and then went and had a horrible experience in England. And what Chesterton writes about him in an interesting essay in his book Heretics. Kipling is one of his go-to heretics. And he says Kipling's just a man of the world. He's a man of nowhere. He doesn't actually have allegiance to anything. But he has allegiance to things like honor, and he likes the military. But you can even see traces of this in the movie. It's not that he really cares about the British military so much. He just cares about the idea of being part of an organization with discipline and with rules and with honor and with sacrifice. Like, he likes those qualities. But the fact that he happens to be British is just kind of an accident of history. It's kind of like in the movie, the British are just the stuffy people that allow our heroes to have an opportunity to go on an adventure. And is their culture better than the Indian culture? Well, in some sense, but also the Indian culture is better than them in some sense. And so Kipling was a complicated guy. Anyway, he worked his way through nasty experiences in England and went back to India as a young man, became a journalist, wrote stories, particularly about the military experience, British soldiers, all never from the superior officer's point of view, but all kind of these Cockney guys that, like in the movie, you know, the kind of middle officers. And he hit it big. He had this mix of exoticism and sort of British patriotism as was seen at the time, and common man Cockney slang that really appealed to people. He wrote this collection called the Barrack Room Ballads, from which Gunga Din is taken, and it's all these poems that drive me nuts now. Like, I don't know, maybe there's some of our listeners that actually like them, but it's kind of like reading Jim and Huckleberry Finn. You just have to work your way through the way that they wrote dialect back then. Phonetic dialect writing has always driven me nuts. I don't like it in any old thing, and I'm glad that we as a culture have mostly moved away from writing phonetic dialect, because it just is annoying to have to translate. But this whole collection is written in sort of Cockney phonetic dialect. But then he moved to America. This guy bounced around, and in America, he started writing the Just So stories for his children, two of whom died, one of whom died of pneumonia at 6. And he really hit it big again, re-hit it big, hit it even bigger with Jungle Book, which was hugely popular at the time, and the Just So stories. But then he had this weird life where even during his time, people were sneering at him, looking down on him, thinking he was a racist, a jingoist. His whole worldview fell out of fashion while he was still alive, and not just among leftists, but among everyone. Because World War I happened while he was still alive, and World War I pretty much ended the British Empire and just showed people a view of war and of imperialism and of all this. It's just like all the kind of romantic notions you could have about that stuff just fell to pieces in World War I. And so people were like, we're not really on board with this whole Kipling thing anymore. I found a really interesting essay by George Orwell, written at the time, who of course was a leftist, but he said of Kipling is a jingo imperialist. He is morally insensitive and aesthetically disgusting. During 5 literary generations, every enlightened person has despised him, and at the end of that time, 9/10 of those enlightened persons are forgotten, and Kipling is in some sense still there. That's how the essay starts, and then Orwell's like, what is the deal? Why do people like this guy when everyone also hates this guy? And so his answer in part is from this later quote in the essay, quote, he identified himself with the ruling power and not with the opposition. In a gifted writer, this seems to us strange and even disgusting, but it did have the advantage of giving Kipling a certain grip on reality. The ruling power is always faced with the question, in such and such circumstances, what would you do? Whereas the opposition is not obliged to take responsibility or make any real decisions. Moreover, anyone who starts out with a pessimistic reactionary view of life tends to be justified by events, for utopia never arrives. Kipling sold out to the British governing class, not financially, but emotionally. This warped his political judgment, for the British ruling class were not what he imagined, and it led him into an abyss of folly and snobbery. But he gained a corresponding advantage from at least having tried to imagine what action and responsibility are like, which I think is really interesting. Like, Kipling, if he was writing Star Wars, he's the idiot that wrote it from the Empire's point of view, is what Orwell is saying. But the Empire is actually trying to build, however terrible they are, they're trying to build a civilization, whereas all the rebels can do is
react and respond.
And so
that makes him interesting.
He's like, okay, what should civilization look like? What should we be doing with all these planets? How should we run a galactic senate? What
eggs should we break in order to make our omelet?
Right. And what actually constitutes a hero in our warring class, and what constitutes a villain, and what constitutes real responsibility and real manhood and all this. Kipling, and this is why he's a darling of a certain kind of conservative these days, asked and answered these questions.
That's part of what's fun about Andor, actually.
Yeah.
Andor's not from the perspective of the Galactic Empire primarily, but it gives you a little bit of that. And it also gives you the window on these rebels as people are in a corner and have nothing they can do but react. And to what degree are they willing to sell their souls for an idea and compromise their consciences or their principles?
Right.
and become just as Machiavellian as the Empire in order to attain their goals. It plays with a lot of big ideas like that you normally don't find Star Wars trying to play with. That's fun and kind of cool and kind of it keeps you watching and kind of keeps you there for it, along with some beautiful cinematography. And it's a slower story. I'm not trying to plug Andor,
Right.
but it is like, in terms of ideas for how to play in Star Wars, it's a case study and somebody actually trying to do something interesting and ask questions that are worth asking.
Yeah, I still haven't watched Andor, but I was thinking about the difference between the prequels, which even with their sort of reclamation, people still like to dump on the prequels these days. The prequels are actually George Lucas being Kipling. You're like, okay, what does a Jedi class look like? What does the galactic ruling class look like? What are their values? He's answering those questions. Maybe he's doing a corny or bad job of it, but then you compare that to J.J. Abrams, who's like, I don't even want to tell you what happened really after the Rebels won. My imagination doesn't go that far. I'm just going to reset everything so that we can still be the embattled kind of reactionaries, because that's the only thing that I know everybody in my audience will resonate with, which is so boring. I mean, it works in a cynical kind of a way. It does give those movies the energy that they need.
Paid.
We're reset. We're back to just being the good guys on the run, narrowly surviving, which is a good place to have your heroes. But it does dodge a lot of interesting questions, like what did the rebellion... I mean, I know you can go into Star Wars lore and figure that out, but...
Well, every stupid decision like that creates a problem that backs the writers and the actual creatives in the smaller spaces into corners that they come up with creative ideas and solutions. Dave Filoni's made a career out of living in that space and doing a good job with it. And so of just sort of the novelists and writers like Timothy Zahn, I've never read any Star Wars book or novel, but
yeah, I mean, that was what was interesting about the original Zahn trilogy was, okay, we defeated the Empire, now we got to establish a thing, and here are the kind of remnants of the Empire that are regathering, and there's some forward momentum. We're building on something.
What are the contingencies? And part of the problem the story itself creates is, man, if Palpatine really was such an evil genius, then what were the contingencies?
Right.
Because he would have had 1,000 of them.
Right.
He would have had to. He brought down the entire Jedi Order. He consolidated power across the entire galaxy. How did he pull that off and then get taken down by a man in a robot suit?
Right. I mean, the Zahn ants.
That's why in broad strokes, Abrams' idea actually works.
Yeah.
Or can be made sense of retroactively. Right.
Yeah. But it's still ethically, morally, it's not an interesting, or just thematically, it's not interesting to just have the sequel trilogy
be a reboot, rehash with modern.
Yeah.
And it's like, even if people are, Rey is just a Skywalker and we're blowing up another super weapon. There's those kinds of things. But it's also, I think much more disturbing actually is we're just going to be a spiritual rehash. We're just going to be a thematic rehash. We're not going to move the idea of what this universe is forward at all.
It actually freezes every character too. No, actually every character got stuck. You thought that they had a victory and they were going to grow and take more responsibility. But
there was no growth.
There was no growth. There was no victory. In fact, they even went backwards.
Yeah, redemption's not real.
Right.
It just undoes everything that you like when you're done with the original Star Wars.
Right. Which is why I thought this essay by Orwell.
Luke should have been whole.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Well, but it's hard. Does Luke get married? Timothy Zahn had him get married to Mara Jade, all this stuff. It's like, it's actually hard, and you risk...
Well, he's gay now, so...
Right, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, right.
Thanks for that.
But you risk being cheesy when you begin to answer these questions, and you risk... It's like Kipling's out of fashion. George Lucas is, to some degree, still out of fashion. And so it's like, once you actually try to imagine what the good version looks like and what the problems of responsibility, as Orwell says, are, it's a lot harder than just saying, well, there's a monolithic villain and we got to fight the villain. So maybe you just don't make Star Wars sequels. I mean, that's another option. But then how would you make money? How would you make money? You'd have to find another story. You'd have to invent one. We're not doing that.
That's hard.
That's hard.
It's called Rebel Moon. Zack Snyder.
Okay, well, I am looking forward to that.
Me too.
Anyway, that's a tiny little thing on Kipling. Let's talk about the movie real quick.
I don't know how I hate Zack Snyder, but the world has made me a Zack Snyder fan. It's not that I like him. It's that everything is so bad.
Everything is so bad, and his Justice League was really fun.
Yeah,
His Justice League cut was actually legitimately fun, and I don't know, in a world where somebody's just willing to make bold choices and plant a flag and ask questions, even if his questions are stupid and the flag he plants is ridiculous and his choices are retarded, like it buys him respect in a world where Marvel has turned everything gray and gay.
Yep. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Snyder is not good. He's not good. You just watch 300. It's so stupid and terrible and bro and fascist. But he's interesting, at least.
You just said bro and fascist, and now I want to watch it. I've never seen it.
It's not good.
I've looked at the comic by Frank Miller. Yeah, it's nah.
It's not good. Watch Gladiator again if you want a cheesy Roman epic. So producer Edward Small options the poem in 1936 and joins RKO and starts to develop this film just based on a poem, because back then that was the kind of IP that actually resonated with people. With Howard Hawks, the famed director of Scarface, Bringing Up Baby, Only Angels Have Wing, His Girl Friday, Ball of Fire, The Big Sleep, Red River, Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, Rio Bravo, the sort of hard-bitten, fast-talking, quintessential director of his time. And it's Hawks that's like, let's not actually make a movie about this Indian water carrier. That's only going to get us so much. He can be a supporting character. Instead, let's make a fun movie about bros with jokes and stuff like that, which is very in line with, if anybody's ever seen His Girl Friday or some of those kinds of things. They're just witty banter movies. And so they stole from a story by Kipling called Soldiers 3, which this is actually much more of an adaptation of than it is of Dean. They made Dean a supporting character. Then Hawks had the misfortune of making for RKO a film called Bringing Up Baby, which is well regarded now, and you guys have probably seen it because
I haven't actually.
You have not? Neither one of you seen it?
I've seen it.
Yeah. I do not like Bringing Up Baby at all. I do not find it to be funny.
Wait, is that the one with the newspaper reporter?
No, that's His Girl Friday.
Oh, okay.
Bringing Up Baby has Cary Grant's a bumbling paleontologist, and Katharine Hepburn is a zany.
I haven't seen it.
Yeah, it's horrible. I don't know why people like it. If you want to see Katharine Hepburn at her most annoying, and then the movie does not punish her for it at all, but rather just punishes Cary Grant and has him just be a simp along. I don't know. Maybe I'm a horrible sexist or something, but I hate Bringing Up Baby. And so does everyone. Did everyone else?
Who wants to see Cary Grant be a simp?
Well, yeah, that's the real thing, is he's just kind of this bumbling, quiet dude. And it's like, no, I want him to be the creator.
We didn't get enough Cary Grant just oozing masculine bravado and sexuality before he aged out.
Yeah.
We should have gotten more of that.
Exactly. And if he's going to be the funny guy, he has to be the funny guy like in Gunga Din. He has to be really funny. He has to be actively funny. He can't be the passive straight man. Cary Grant's not actually made to be a straight man.
He's got to be Harrison Ford.
Yeah, exactly.
Harrison Ford can be the funny man, but he still has to have his verve.
Right, exactly. And so in Bringing Up Baby, it's like Katharine Hepburn's knocking things over and letting tigers out of there, and Cary Grant's just like, what? Huh? The whole time. And it's just completely demoralizing and emasculating for one of the great actors.
I'll let Jimmy Stewart do that.
Yeah, Jimmy Stewart can do that kind of thing and just
keep his dignity.
Well, the thing that Jimmy Stewart would do is he'd be angry about it the whole time.
Right. He'd be simmering.
And that would make you like him. I do not like Cary Grant in that role. I also do not like the entire oeuvre of Gary Cooper, because I feel like unless he's in High Noon, he's usually playing a character like that who's just like, huh, what? I'm just bumpkin that's off my game. Even
Sergeant York?
Yeah, even Sergeant York is kind of like that.
Lou Gehrig?
He's also way too old for every role he ever was famous for. I just don't like Gary Cooper. But one day we'll talk about Sergeant York, I'm sure. Maybe one day we'll talk about Lou Gehrig, whatever that movie's called.
Pride of the Yankees.
Yeah. So anyway.
Come on.
Yeah.
I've seen it.
I know what it was called. Sometimes I pretend to know less than I do.
Does it have baseball in it?
It's a defense mechanism.
Guess who's seen it?
Yeah.
This guy. This guy. So, who has two thumbs and seen Pride of the Yankees?
It's really Shut up. I hate your guts.
Okay, so Howard Hawks made Bringing Up Baby. It was a colossal financial failure. Katharine Hepburn played her greatest role as box office poison and retreated to Broadway, where she would lick her wounds and develop Philadelphia Story as a comeback vehicle, a very successful one. But meanwhile, Hawks is now not in vogue, so he's kicked off of Gunga Din after developing it. And so they bring in George Stevens. We've talked about George Stevens once before. Do you guys remember the film that we have watched that we really like a lot that George Stevens did for RKO from the same era? Would have done it maybe a year or two before this.
Sorry, I said again.
The film that George Stevens did that we have talked about on this podcast at great length that we really like.
That he would have done in the mid-30s.
That he would have done in the mid-30s. Probably one of the only mid-30s movies we've actually done.
Oh, goodness. It went out of my brain.
Can you name a star or two stars of this movie?
Jimmy Stewart.
Nope. It's a famous male-female duo. That ought to do it.
Happened one night.
Nope.
That's way earlier.
That's
right?
Capra.
That's Capra.
And it's Capra. Yeah. Everything that I can think of
Oh,
is
good
Capra.
grief. Oh, Astaire and Rogers.
Yeah, Swing Time.
Oh, yeah.
Swing Time. George Stevens was a famous comedy director. He came up with the Hal Roach Studios, who did Our Gang, Laurel and Hardy, stuff like that. Have any of you guys ever watched Laurel and Hardy? They're kind of not
yeah,
really
not
available.
really.
I've watched a couple.
Did you like them?
No, I
Yeah.
watched them as a kid.
They're kind of slow, right? Like
Slow. They weren't very funny. As a kid, I could still like Marx Brothers, but not them.
Marx Brothers are fast and zany. Three Stooges are fast and zany. Laurel and Hardy are like, I'm going to slowly set up this thing. I'm going to bumble into the slow thing that you've set up. It's going to happen to me slowly. I'm going to react with a funny face. Slowly and subtly. A lot of like adults would say it's their favorite sort of, you know, it's got subtlety. It's like I went to a restaurant one time and we ate boring, bland toast, but it was an expensive restaurant. And another person who was there was like, it has a subtle flavor. I was like, yeah, it sucks. I like actual flavor, not subtle flavor. That's
I like how you said a lot of adults, like
you know, people who suck. You know,
a lot of adults.
Serious, boring, stupid people. So he made Alice Adams, which was a big movie. He made Swing Time. He made The More, the Merrier, and Gunga Din. He was basically a sparkling comedy director. But then he went to war. And he's one of the guys that came back the most changed from World War II. So he made a bunch. He's actually most famous for the serious kind of social issues movies that he made after. So he made A Place in the Sun and Shane, which is a great Western, and Giant with what's his face? They're tearing me apart. Diary of Anne Frank. He made like all these, like he never made, it's kind of an interesting thing. He went to war and then never could bring himself to make a comedy. Like the world was just not funny to him. And this is the guy that made Swing Time, the most light souffle of a perfect little movie. So anyway, he ended up on Gunga Din and brought in some Hal Roach writers to punch it up and make it funny. William Faulkner supposedly may have also worked on this movie just because this was in Faulkner's drunk Hollywood, I hate myself and need money period. Memorably immortalized in the Coen brothers, Barton Fink. They've got kind of a Faulkner analog character in that who's drunk and like his secretary is actually writing the scripts. But you'll see Faulkner's name on things from the time. And then they end up with Victor McLaughlin, Cary Grant, and Douglas Fairbanks Jr. I'm sure we've talked about these. We've talked about all. Well, no, we haven't talked about Douglas Fairbanks Jr. because why would we? Because this is about the only thing he's remembered for at this point. But we've talked about old Archibald Leach before, born in Bristol, England. He joined a British vaudeville troupe doing knockabout comedy, flips and pies in the face kind of stuff. When he was 16, he went with this troupe and toured the U.S. and ended up staying on in New York, became big in vaudeville, and then was taken into the Hollywood fold in the 30s and renamed as Cary-Grant and had to completely invent himself. And like so many people we've talked about, I think, what's her name? What's James Bond's beloved girl that dies? Eva Green's character in Casino Royale.
Vesper?
Yeah, Vesper. She says, "You wear your suit with such disdain," or something like that. I think that Cary Grant brings a little bit of that energy, a little bit of the Sean Connery energy and the original James Bond, that just kind of like here's a guy that actually wasn't born in a suit, and he's become the embodiment of suave, cool sophistication. But part of the reason he's able to do that is actually because he's sort of ironically commenting on it, standing outside of it. He's bringing a little bit of an edge and a swagger to it that he wouldn't bring otherwise. And so it's like even something like North by Northwest, where you have a relatively funny and sedate Cary Grant, there's just an edge or something there that makes him more interesting than a guy who feels like he was actually born with a silver spoon in his mouth. So the legend about this movie is that Cary Grant knew he would be best in the comedic role, but they offered him the Douglas Fairbanks part, the guy that's in love with the girl, the most boring part of the three. And Cary Grant, the legend at least, is that he knew the funny part would be good for him and won it in a coin toss from Douglas Fairbanks Jr. Too bad for Douglas Fairbanks Jr. He probably would have popped more in the Cary Grant part. Anybody would have. It's just a better part. But it also may be true that Cary Grant took the role he wanted and then lobbied for Douglas Fairbanks Jr. to even be in the movie. So either he was Douglas Fairbanks Jr.'s biggest supporter or the guy that screwed him out of his entire career. We don't really know. Probably the bad one, but that's just my read of human nature. I don't know anything one way or another. McLaughlin we just talked about because he played the bad guy in The Quiet Man. He's her brother. And if you listen to that episode, you know he was a guy that ran away from home to join in the Second Boer War, of all things. But they got kicked out when they realized he was a 14-year-old, and then went around as a heavyweight boxer and a wrestler and a circus attraction just because he was a big, burly guy that could get work doing that kind of stuff. And then got swept up into the Hollywood machine, as so many people did, and became part of John Ford's kind of company of actors, was in The Quiet Man and won an Oscar for The Informer with John Ford. And he's just a dude. He's a very lovable presence on screen, even in The Quiet Man, playing the ostensibly villainous part. He's got a good sort of a line on vulnerable, tough guys that get hit on the head with flower pots and make goofy faces and that kind of stuff. Douglas Philip Fairbanks Jr. is the very definition of that wonderful new phrase, a Nepo baby. He was a Nepo baby. He's the son of Douglas Fairbanks Sr., who was a giant star of the silent era, famous for things like The Mark of Zorro and Thief of Baghdad and Robin Hood. You may have seen clips of Douglas Fairbanks sword fighting, and then he's like the original guy who the bridge is going up over the moat and he grabs onto it and gets lifted up, and like he created all that stuff that Errol Flynn would do, and then Indiana Jones would steal. And so that's Fairbanks Sr. And the talkies, as they did so many times, the Singing in the Rain story, the talkies killed Senior. Nobody wanted to hear him talk. But they also gave his son a career because just basically on his dad's name, he got a contract with Paramount when he was 13 years old for $1,000 a week. But he didn't quite Nepo baby it because that didn't produce a hit. And so he kind of got removed and had to go work as a cameraman's assistant and kind of work his way up. And he did hundreds of movies, dozens of movies. He did a lot of movies, but Gunga Din is really the one that he's remembered for. He basically he could play a good kind of straight arrow hero type with a square jaw, but he didn't bring that extra spark that like a Cary Grant or somebody brings to it. He's good in this movie though. We also have Sam Jaffe, I think that's how you say his name, Yiddish theater guy in his 40s, who's playing the little Indian guy that probably should be in his 20s or something like that. But he was always cast as these ethnic parts. He did a lot of brown face, black face type stuff. He played I guess you'd say Chinese kind of guru, a wise holy man in Frank Capra's Lost Horizon. And other things like that. He always shows up as a character actor, and they're always asking him to do ridiculous things. Gunga Din's definitely his most famous thing. Then we have the Italian Edoardo Chianelli, who plays the evil, what do you call him? I forget.
I don't remember.
We should say we were prepared to talk about this movie the day that Ben had his twins. Or that Megan.
Ben gave birth.
Yes, Ben gave birth. We were all shocked. We thought his wife was going to do it.
No one more than me.
Ben hadn't even put on any weight. But Ben had some twins, and so we were prepared to talk about this movie many weeks ago.
I stayed up late the night before the day we were supposed to record it, watching it.
Right.
And the next day, The babies are coming.
Yeah, I think Jake
And that would was like 3.5 weeks ago or something.
Yeah, I want to say
It's been a
Jake
while.
texted me like, "Huh, that movie. Here's some thoughts." And then the next text was like, "We're headed to the hospital." From Ben. So it's like, oh, well, I guess we're not going to talk about that movie anytime soon. We should talk very briefly about Joan Fontaine. She was 19 years old. She is actually Joan de Beauvoir de Havilland. She is Olivia Havilland's sister, Olivia Havilland being Errol Flynn's leading lady in Robin Hood, stuff like that. She's also plays Melanie in Gone with the Wind. It's just kind of interesting because you had these two sisters who both hit it big. People didn't know that they were sisters because Joan had changed her name, and they hated each other and fought to see who would get the Oscar first and they were like up for the same roles and kind of stuff like that. Olivia de Havilland kind of won just because A, she was in Gone with the Wind, so she'll be remembered forever. B, she was in the Errol Flynn movies, so she'll be remembered forever. And she's great as Errol Flynn's leading lady. They have a lot of chemistry together and things like Robin Hood or the Captain Blood or things like that. But Joan Fontaine had a nice career too. She was in Alfred Hitchcock's adaptation of Rebecca. She plays that simpering character in that thing. She was in Ivanhoe. She was in Alfred Hitchcock's Suspicion. Those are probably the things that you might know her for. All those parts much better than the part that she gets to play in this film. I don't think you'll accuse me of being a feminist if I say this film does not do Joan Fontaine's character any favors. So they filmed this movie in Lone Pine, California, the foothills of the Sierras, where so many great westerns were filmed. Stevens immediately went way over budget and actually did just about as much damage to the studio's pocketbook as they were afraid Howard Hawks was going to do. Basically, he spent weeks and weeks on that opening action scene, which you can tell that opening action scene's great. I wish he'd been able to spend weeks and weeks on other action scenes.
Yeah.
But the other claim to fame about this movie, everybody thinks that Gone with the Wind was the first one to cross the damn finish line. The first movie to say damn is Gone with the Wind. Frankly, my dear, he doesn't give a damn. But this movie actually has a damn, and it came out before Gone with the Wind. So what you would do is you would just pay the fine to the Catholic censor board would censor you and fine you, and then you'd say, we're just going to pay it. Which Gone with the Wind made a big deal out of that. There's the famous line from the book, and they just made publicity hay with it at the time. Like, we are standing up for our rights. We are going to have, what's Rhett Butler supposed to say? Like, frankly, my dear, I don't care. No, he's going to say the line that everybody remembers from the book. And so Gone with the Wind became famous for standing up to the man and including the line. But actually, this movie had just kind of done it as a throwaway before that happened. But this was the second highest grossing film of the greatest year in Hollywood history after Gone with the Wind. So people really loved this movie. Really hasn't lasted in the public imagination. But some movies ride an elephant across the bridge of time, and
Some movies try to do that, and the bridge it falls.
Sometimes the rope bridge breaks and the elephant plunges into the gorge of time. I don't know. What did you, I guess, general thoughts, reporting for duty. Ben, what did you think about this film?
Oh, that it was Michael Bay-ish, like we were talking about near the beginning of this podcast, and that it had its fun moments and it's some stuff that's kind of interesting, maybe more from like, I've seen the movies that came out of this movie.
Or from an academic standpoint than an actual grabbing your heart.
Yeah. I was often, I dare say I was often bored.
Yeah, I wish this movie held up a little bit better. I was super excited to share this movie with you guys and share this movie with our fans, but it didn't turn out to be quite the slam dunk that my brain had turned it into. But I still think I liked it a decent amount better than you did. And let's see how Jake felt about it. Jake?
I don't remember how I felt.
I'm the one who had the twins. I still remember how I felt.
I feel like I had a take of some kind, and I don't remember what it was. I don't resent, looking back, I'll say I don't resent having watched it. I'm glad to have seen it. I have no desire or need to ever see it again.
Do you think our listeners should see it?
It's a fine, silly, funny night at the movies.
And Ben, you would really burning our cakes up front here, but
sure.
You'd say no, listeners.
It's fine. I wouldn't say anyone should go out of their way to see it. That's what I'd say. It has some really fun sequences. It has a fun bad guy. What's his name? Cianelli?
Yeah.
Eduardo. The Italian playing an evil Indian cult leader.
Yeah.
That guy's really fun.
Yeah, you definitely see the DNA of Temple of Doom in this movie.
Oh yeah,
that part's fun.
like that guy is definitely who we're aspiring to recreate.
Right. Well, and they sneak into a temple and there's a big, scary demon lady god and a bunch of cultists with torches. And
yeah, let's just amp that up to 1,000.
Yeah, Spielberg definitely took that and ran with it, pumped some adrenaline into it. Yeah. But
I loved how it ended. Where it just kept going on and on and on.
Oh, man.
Trying to get every bit of emotion possible out of Gunga Din.
That was amazing.
It was hilarious. And they gave us, Old Lang Syne?
They played old. So the way this movie ends, so if people don't know, the most famous image from this movie and something that has made something of a cultural impact is the cavalry's riding into a trap and all of our heroes are incapacitated. Whatever shall they do? And then this lowly Indian water boy who's just dreamed of being a soldier.
The whole movie.
And he's already been stabbed through the permutations of the plot. Like he's got one foot in a grave and the other foot in a banana peel, I tells you. But he grabs the bugle and struggles up onto
the spire
of this temple and manages to blow the bugle just in time. Like the bad guys are cocking their rifles.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and then he gets heroically gunned down as the British are like, "What?
A bugle call?
A bugle call?
This must be an ambush.
Let's decimate the brown people." And then they do.
But yeah, what I remembered just now actually is I watched this movie in pieces, like mostly on my iPad, just sneaking it in. And so all of the setups that were so obviously setups for the payoff, I just didn't connect those dots until it happened. And then when I saw it come together, I just I remember laughing out loud through all the emotional scenes.
Right.
Because there's a lot of stuff where it's like, "Say, Din, this is my bugle. It's a bugle that I have. Doesn't come in handy for anything at all.
You can have it for no reason.
Yeah.
I will learn to play the warning march on the bugle, and I will practice it in a humorous way, and then you will yell at me for it.
Right.
I want to be a soldier. And can I be a soldier? No, you can't be a soldier because you're an idiot brown person.
Right.
But I really want to be a soldier." And all these really hammy setups for how it was all going to if you watch it in one sitting and you're the least bit checked in, you know how this movie ends 5 minutes into it.
Right.
But for whatever reason, watching it in pieces, maybe not caring, I was really amused when all the pieces came together because I just hadn't tracked any of it. And it was just really amusing to see the big bow they put on it. And then they just kept making the bow bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. They play Old Lang Syne and they're gonna...
Well, and then they have a superimposed image of Dean, the now deceased Dean, in a colonial soldier's garb, saluting the audience.
Right, with the flag.
With the British flag as...
We have Ghost Gunga Din.
Yeah, it's just...
As Old Lang Syne plays and the old man reads his tribute.
It is fun in an academic sense to say, okay, George Lucas, what a genius. We can take all these cliches, we can repurpose them, we can set them on another planet, and we can add just a touch of irony, a touch more of irony even than they have here, and we can make people we could make a generation of kids actually connect to all this stuff, all these kind of soldier cliches and stuff in a way that they wouldn't if they just went back and watched this movie. So
it might have still even got some emotion out of me, despite laughing through it.
Yeah, that's what your text said. Your text was it got me. I shed a tear or two. Which, how can you not, old Gunga Din? He saves the cavalry. Which, by the way, if anyone does watch this movie, I highly encourage them not to watch the whole movie, but just to watch the very beginning of what's that guy's name? It's an easy name.
Peter Sellers.
Peter Sellers, yes, of Peter Sellers' The Party, which begins with a hilarious spoof of the famous Gunga Din.
It was really funny. You showed
scene.
it to me. I've laughed over it, thinking about it since then.
It's funny. I will show it to Jake as soon as this thing is over.
I'm looking forward to getting this done with so I can see it.
I will not ruin it, though, for Jake or for anyone who's not seen it. Gee, what else can we say about this movie? It does have a really great action scene in the first third, kind of we're getting things off and running scene as our heroes go to investigate a distress call, basically, from this village that's been taken over by the thugs, I suppose I should say. And then they walk into this deserted village, and you begin to see little signs of guys crouching behind doorways and stuff. And then all hell breaks loose, as they say, and our people are throwing dynamite at them, and they're throwing it right back, and people are emptying thousands of rounds and bullets and stuff at them, and they're not getting hurt, but they're picking off the bad guys like flies and jumping over rooftops. And it's fun to see that this cliche goes back as long. It's got our backs are up against the wall, and we've got to do a perilous jump into a waterfall or something like there's a cliff, and there's some water, and
it's giant. It's actually pretty big.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, all that was really fun. You could see that he spent a lot of time on it.
Yeah. That stuff was really fun. But then, and the ending of the movie is fun. Like once Cary Grant, I guess we should just say, people can probably piece it together, but you want to just say what this movie was about, or what the plot, for anyone who's wondering at this juncture in the podcast.
The plot?
Yeah, like
there's a Thuggee cult, and they go find it. They go find the temple where this cult is located, and
nonsense. The Tuggies have been decimated. They don't exist anymore.
They talk about that Sleeman guy. They actually named. They're like, since Sleeman did his thing,
right?
They've been routed.
They're still around.
We got 3 guys, and they're scheming for finding treasure while they're on their stupid India jaunt, waiting to go home, and one of them's engaged to be married and can't wait to get out, and always looking for the next thing. And the Tuggies show up, and they're just the guys to go take down the Thuggee cult.
Mm-hmm.
And it's hilarious, and they just do.
Yep. So the first third of this movie is pretty good. You're getting distressed calls, and the Tuggies are like emerging from
They're going to wipe out a whole city.
Right. And then we'll show up, and the city will be deserted, and we got some nice ambience and some nice heroism and stuff. And then the ending of this movie is good. Cary Grant thinks he's going on a sort of fortune hunting expedition, but he ends up in the temple of Kali, surrounded by cultists, and then his friends come to rescue him, and then the cavalry's not far behind, and that's all good. But where the reason why we're all sort of not in on this movie, I dare say, is you've got this middle section, which is just lame comedy. That does not really cross the bridge of time.
It does not cross the bridge of time. It does not cross the bridge of, let's make this plot make any sense. It's just like soldiers being silly and doing things.
Well, there's a scene that's got to be 10 minutes where Douglas Fairbanks has decided he's going to get married, and so they have his replacement, and Cary Grant and Victor McLaughlin.
Ditch the replacement and get him to sign back on.
Right.
And then they're going to be angry at each other for some reason, and you lock Cary Grant in the brig. And
yeah, I mean, it's got some nice proto-bro camaraderie, the kind of stuff that, I don't know, like Lethal Weapon did so well later on, that kind of, our guys are joshing each other, and they kind of all have love-hate relationships with each other and playing jokes on each other. It does that kind of thing. Or I guess Butch and Sundance would be the big analog. But yeah, so it really is just a comedy about those guys for the middle half, and it's amazing how little time we spend building up Gunga Din or making him any kind of character whatsoever. There are 2 things I didn't really remember. There's 3 things. A, I didn't remember the middle chunk being so thoroughly comedy. And frankly, after a decade or more of not seeing it, why would I? There's nothing all that memorable about it. B, I didn't remember how nothing these characters were. Like, Victor McLaughlin's character trait is he loves his elephant. I think I just told you everything we know about him.
Really? Yeah, it's true.
Cary Grant's character trait is he wants gold. Douglas Fairbanks' character trait is, I'm leaving my bros behind to get married.
Because I'm an idiot, and eventually I'll come around.
Right. And when I do, I'll plant a wet one on her lips and say, gotta join the boys, honey. Sorry. Actually, his speech is something like, the problem with you is you don't want a man. You want a coward.
It's actually the best scene in the movie, in my opinion. That moment where he's just like, wait a minute. You don't want a man.
Yeah.
You want a coward who would leave his boys behind. And so that's not me, and it's not going to be. And I don't care what you think.
And I'm not, but what he does is.
But it was so plug and play. It was just amazing. It's just like.
I don't mind the moment. I think it's a great moment.
I loved it.
I just think if you have Maureen
Because
O'Hara.
it's such an artifact.
Yes, it is. It's nice and refreshing to see that. I just think if the girl had been given any kind of character to play or dignity or anything before that, you could really have a great moment. But instead, she's basically the antagonist. I mean, even more than the Indian guy, she's like the bad guy. She's like, Ronald, I want you to join my tea company and you won't be playing with your friends anymore. And
right.
Then they don't give her anything to do besides be the annoying female. But she gets put in her place. He gives her that speech and then he gives her a big kiss, like grabs her and ducks her and kisses her and then jumps on his horse and rides away, leaving her breathless. So good for Douglas Fairbanks Jr. But there's a lot of elephant comedy. I dare say more elephant comedy than the average film goer of today wants.
How many people had seen an elephant in 1937?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you couldn't just pull one up on the internet. Maybe you could find a picture book at your local library.
You had an elephant. It was tamed. You could do tricks with it. It was cool. Why not make some hay with that? You're going to get the elephant. You're going to pay for the elephant. You're going to pay the trainers and the circus people.
Right. Yeah.
People come back to see more elephant, maybe.
Yeah. The elephant stuff, I dare say, played really well back then. It doesn't matter now. Like a 5-year-old might like it. Like, hey, it's an elephant. But you are putting up with a lot of elephant stuff in this movie. And that's dopey scene where they drug the guy's drink in order to incapacitate him so that Douglas Fairbanks Jr. will have to join them on their next adventure. Goes on and on and on and on. And it's a lot of...
not very funny comedy.
Yeah. I don't even like that kind of stuff when Bill Murray does it. I don't usually like... There's this whole thing of bro humor. I think the most successful version of it ever is the beginning of Ghostbusters when Bill Murray is making eyes with the cute girl and zapping the guy and just being a jerk. That's pretty funny because Bill Murray's so outrageously cynical and mean that you have to laugh. But usually when it's like that kind of whole strain of frat boy humor where I just don't like pranks in real life. I don't like them being played on me. I don't really like being part of them. Ha ha, we tricked you.
Now your life sucks.
Now your life sucks. We put you in the hospital. I know, again, there's a whole strain of our listeners who listen to us because they like Christian masculinity and stuff like that, and they probably think what our culture needs is more pranks. But I'm sorry, I'm just an effeminate kind of person, I guess, who does not like being in an outhouse and having someone tip it over so that they can... And then I have to act like... I'm amused by this in order to be accepted into their stupid peer group. Like, no, I don't want to be part of your stupid peer group if you're going to tip over the outhouse while I'm in it. It's not funny. No one's ever tipped over an outhouse on me. I don't know.
That's a great characterization of...
I've talked about this before on some podcasts, but I don't know. I had a friend we'd be in the basement and he'd be like, your mom is calling you. And then I'd run up into the kitchen upstairs and it would turn out, get this, fellas, my mom wasn't calling me. I was an idiot for trusting my friend, for believing basic statements that he made. And that sort of whole strain of like, haha, I belittled you, not based on any real flaw in you but I just found some way to make you look small and weak. And now you need to accept it in order to be part of things. Not a fan. So, Gunga Din, the worst movie ever. What else is there to talk about? Is there anything else to talk about? Oh, it does have one of my favorite, quote unquote, cliches at the end where there's a journalist that is going along with them.
Turns out it's Rudyard Kipling.
Yeah. I love movies where it's like, and that's the story of how my boat was destroyed by Moby Dick. Now, what did you say your name was again? My name is Herman Melville. And in the filmmaker's mind, the audience is supposed to be like, what? The movie's always patting itself on the back.
Oh, dear.
Well, we solved those murders in the Rue Morgue. Now, what did you say your name was again? Well, my name's Edgar Poe. Edgar Poe? That's a silly name. Maybe you should add your middle name. What is it? It's Edgar Allan Poe. Yes, that sounds better. and the whole stupid fat audience is supposed to be like shoving popcorn in their mouth and be like, what? Edgar Allan Poe. The disconnect between what the movie expects of me and what actually happens in those moments. Like, has anyone ever been surprised by that? I'm trying to think of a real movie where that happens. Stupid example, but Shanghai Noon or Shanghai Nights. You remember that awesome movie?
Oh, how could I forget it?
Jackie Chan and Owen Wilson in England.
Yes.
And there's like a little urchin boy who's helping him out and doing like flips and Jackie Chan
Bruce
stuff.
Lee?
No, he's a little white boy. And it's the turn of the century, 20th century.
I forgot this completely.
So they're like, at the very end, they're like, say kid, what's your name? And he's like, my name's Charlie Chaplin. And my eyes got permanent damage. They rolled back into my head, and I've never been able to get them to dislodge. And
I forgot that 100%. That's a terrible movie.
But I just remember, like, I could be a snob. We all know I can be a snob. But am I really being a snob when I'm sitting I'm in a crowded theater, and we've all been enjoying this Jackie Chan movie, and there's actually a person that goes, they didn't get the real Charlie Chaplin. It's just some kid that they wrote into the script that they said nothing happened. The real Charlie Chaplin wasn't influenced by the real Jackie Chan. You didn't just learn something interesting. What is wrong with people? Why? There actually are people that are like,
it's a trap.
It's a trap. But this movie, like, it breaks both its arms, patting itself on the back with like, say, sir, why don't you say the poem? What was that poem you wrote again, Mr. Kipling? And then he does like the whole Gunga Din poem, and it's just very silly.
It's very silly.
So.
And then we have this, not the silhouette, but we have the transparent image of Gunga Din
Right.
saluting in uniform as though from heaven.
Yep.
As the movie fades.
The movie fades.
That was
To Old Lang
amazing.
Syne.
To Old Lang
To
Syne.
Auld Lang Syne.
Yeah.
Oh.
Oh my goodness. So, how many strangle scarfs out of 40 do you give? I guess one other thing we should say: if you want to see Cary Grant really in a very broadly comedic role, this is that.
Which I never do.
Maybe you don't want to see that.
I never do.
And the other thing that's weird is it feels like he really does not want to reveal his Cockney roots, right? It's because he was a Cockney kid,
Right.
and he's projecting that he's putting on a Cockney accent.
Right.
in
He's almost doing a
places,
Dick
and
Van
then
Dyke or something.
Yeah, like where he's moving out of it and then throwing it on in a hammy way here and there in places. And it's like he wants you to think that this is not who I am, this is who I'm pretending to be. And he won't just do the character. And it just feels weird.
Yeah.
I don't know if that makes sense. I don't know if you guys felt that. But it was just like, dude, just play the character. Like, you've got the tools to play the character. Play the character. It's fine. It'll be fine. Nobody's going to look down on you for playing the character
Yeah.
that you're supposed to be playing just because you're afraid it's revealing too much about yourself or something.
Yeah. Maybe that accounts for why I didn't like it. It was like there was this weird sideways aspect to his performance that
Just insecure,
didn't
actually,
make sense.
is what it feels like in a way that isn't becoming to Cary Grant.
Yeah. He also does a lot of really broad mugging. Like, he'll see something surprising and his eyes will pop out of his head. And like, which Cary Grant can be guilty of that in lots of roles, but usually it's more well integrated and feels more like, but I mean, if you want to see Cary Grant do a very broad Cockney stereotype that seems to not draw on anything from his actual past or personality, then I don't know. It is interesting.
And not play very well with his persona.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I can understand him wanting to play this character instead of, I mean, it's not like any of the characters. I don't know which one I'd want to play. Maybe Victor McLaglen, but I think that might just be because Victor McLaglen is naturally likable enough that he makes his character seem naturally likable. I don't know that character is actually all that likable in the script. Douglas Fairbanks has to be, what's the nice way of saying, beholden to the lady the whole movie.
Until such time as he's going to put her in her place.
He's going to put her in her place. And then he does a credible sort of faux Errol Flynn kind of, all right, boys, sort of British thing. But I did think I could hear, I'm just looking through my notes to see if there's anything else that I wanted to talk about. I did think I could hear William Goldman in this movie. If you think about The Princess Bride and the way that they talk and the rhythms of the dialogue, and then you think about lines like, I think Victor McLachlan or somebody says, you displease me greatly and I ignore the both of you. Actually, that's Douglas Fairbanks Jr. The two of them are arguing in prison and we cut over to him and he's wounded or whipped or something.
Well, it's like Wesley is based on
very much
Douglas Fairbanks Jr.
Yeah, definitely.
That's a great connection. I actually hadn't made that connection.
Yeah, you know, it's weird. I'd actually had that thought beforehand. And I had thought that Andre the Giant and Victor McLachlan actually have a lot in common in terms of Andre the Giant. I don't know. I had connected it to The Princess Bride, except that I had both of those thoughts independently.
Yeah,
at various points, but never really thought it was worth saying out loud.
No, I think it is worth saying out loud because it's Goldman, and I think this movie has that sort of, we're playing silly characters, but the dialogue is just a little bit more literate than it would actually be, and just rephrasing things in a way that a Yiddish comedian or something would, you know, like who says, you displease me greatly and I ignore the both of you. Well, the Princess Bride characters are saying things like that constantly, and that's kind of William Goldman's whole deal. So, and Butch and Sundance are the same way. So, all right, Ben, how many strangling scarfs out of 30 do you give? I know it was 40 earlier.
Oh, I was going to say, out of 30? Oh, man. Let's say 17.
17.
Sure.
So, almost a F if we're just going with percentages.
That might be too mean. But 17, I don't know. I'm not thinking in percentages.
Okay.
I'm just thinking in scarves.
Scarves. You're just thinking of strangling scarves. Like you always do.
I might or might not have been taught some murder strangling by my dad. That our listeners might not know about. Probably not.
I'd love to yes and that, but I don't know how to yes and that. I'm sitting here thinking, I like to yes and things, but how do I yes and that? Jake, how many strangle scarves?
22.
22. All right. Yeah, I think 22 strangle scarves is about right. I really was excited to talk about this movie, and I wish it was a 30 strangle scarfer. But it's just not. It's not a movie that has traveled across time all that well.
I'll up my rating to 20. How's that?
Okay, that sounds about 20. Right. Who should, maybe a more productive discussion, who should watch this movie and who should not watch this movie?
Spielberg and Lucas fans.
Who are interested in
the roots.
Yeah. We are not giving you another Steven Spielberg movie. I wish we were.
No, this is just sort of an ad fontes to the sources.
Yeah.
If you want to see, the stuff behind the stuff that you love and where it comes from, and be impressed by what they accomplished. And
yeah,
I mean, there's a lot, like even the elephant humor made it into
Temple of Doom.
Temple of Doom.
Yeah, Temple of Doom
like that, so.
owes a lot to this movie. I mean, Temple of Doom, they're basically just like, let's make the R-rated version of Gunga Din. Like all the things that triggered our imagination, let's take those things and turn them up to 11. And yeah, I think if you're the kind of person that just likes old movies, if you just like watching Cary Grant, if you like to watch TCM or something like that, you'll enjoy this movie. But it's not gonna proselytize you if you're not. If this does not sound like the kind of movie that you'd like, then you will not like this movie. Probably you might be a little bored, honestly. Although I do think that action scene is one of the better action scenes of its time.
Yeah,
this is one of.
Sure.
You reminded me too. This is the first movie that I've ever watched on accelerated speed. Not all of it, but the middle section. I figured out, because I was watching it on my iPad, which I rarely do. I figured out that I could toggle the speed, and I watched sections of that middle half that were just boring.
Yeah.
At 1.5 or 1.75 or 1.25.
Usually an unforgivable sin when it comes to action.
I don't believe in that at all when it comes to movies, but I was pressed for time and it was dragging on.
Yeah, I mean, all you missed was like long scenery shots and people walking and just the lamest kind of comedy, quote unquote. So Sorry. Better luck next time, Gunga Din. All right. Well, folks, I encourage you to watch the Peter Sellers clip from the party, which we're going to do now. But speaking of parties, it's a party every day with our Patron Choice Award of Awesomeness winner, Jeffrey. What is it that makes Jeffrey such a man among men?
Every day, in a manner of speaking, Jeffrey pulls his wounded body atop the spire of progress and blows the bugle of brotherhood.
I just think of that the other day about Jeffrey. He likes to climb the spire of progress and blow the bugle of brotherhood.
Yeah, even if he gets killed for it, he'll still do it.
Even if he gets killed. And I think that's dumb. Like, let's not be killed for blowing the bugle of brotherhood on the spire of progress. Like, much better things to die for, Jeffrey.
Yeah.
But he's still a great guy. He still supports this podcast. And that is all that we have to say about him.
That's right.
All right, folks. Until next time.
You're a better man than I am, Gunga Din.